everyone to the Ontario Trillium Foundation's Collective Impact Granting Stream, Getting Your Community Ready for Collective Impact with Jay Connor and Liz Weaver. This webinar will help you assess your community's readiness and determine if you have what is needed to tackle the complex issues. Thank you so much for joining us today. I would like to present our webinar speakers, Jay Connor and Liz Weaver. Jay brings considerable business success and experience to the challenges of creating community change. Born in Dublin, Ireland, Jay grew up in Chicago and went on to assume senior management role in two multi-billion-dollar corporations, ADT Security and Johnson's Controls. In the mid-1990s, Jay had an epiphany, sold his business, and decided to take his organizational expertise and devote himself to nonprofit sector. We are very happy to have Jay here today. Liz Weaver is the director of the Learning Center and Tamarack's vice president. Liz helps initiatives develop their framework of change, supports and guides their projects, and helps connect them with other comprehensive community collaborations. Liz has also been a director for the Hamilton Roundtable on Poverty Reduction, which was recognized with the Canadian Urban Institute David Crombie Leadership Award in 2009. In her career, Liz has held leadership positions with the YWCA Hamilton, Volunteer Hamilton, and Volunteer Canada. Liz was awarded the Queen Jubilee Medal in 2002 for her leadership in the voluntary sector, was an Athena Award finalist, and in 2004 was awarded the Women in the Workplace Award from the City of Hamilton. Welcome, Jay and Liz, and I'll pass it over to you.
Great. Thanks so much, Heather. I think if we can go to the next slide, that would be great. I'm going to start off, and then we'll invite Jay in. I just want to take you over some of the things that we hope to tackle in this webinar today. We want to spend a bit of time just going over, for those of you that weren't part of the Collective Impact 101 series, some of the conditions of collective impact, just as a quick reminder. Then we're going to throw it over to Jay, and Jay will talk about the 7 habits of highly effective communities. And this comes from writing and thinking that Jay has been doing over the last little while in terms of really looking at communities and what makes communities effective. We're going to spend a bit of time talking about the stages of community readiness that come from the Harwood Institute, and then we're really going to spend another couple of minutes just looking at how we engage community effectively. So those are the goals for the webinar today. Next slide, Heather. We want to start off by showing you this diagram. It comes from the Oxfam around their assessment of the causes of poverty for young mothers, and you can see that it looks really complex, right? And so that's what we've come to learn. I think both myself and Jay, through the work that Jay has done across communities in the United States, and also the work that the Tamarack Institute has done, you know, in looking at communities across Canada and the United States, that communities are complex and that people's experiences in the communities, and particularly people who are facing circumstances that are complex, like poverty or homelessness or, you know, teen suicide, that there's this kind of interconnected web and many dimensions of powerlessness and ill-being. And so that's the kind of broad context in which collective impact is situated. Next slide. Sometimes we respond to this complexity in our own work by looking for kind of simple solutions and siloed approaches. We try to break the problem down to each of its little small segments, and that we often see funders funding kind of these small segments of activity, and that really leads to this kind of culture of collaboration this culture of competition. All of these are failures in terms of how we actually need to approach kind of complex community issues. And what we're seeing in the work of both Tamarack, but also in the investments that the Ontario Trillium Foundation is making through collective impact, is that we need a different kind of solution. We need a different kind of approach. Next slide. that actually leads us to collective impact. And collective impact is taking us out of this notion of siloed approaches and small-scale solutions to this idea of bringing a variety of different actors together from different sectors, building a common agenda, and really trying to solve that kind of specific social problem. And if you think back to that slide a couple of slides ago, you know, the Oxfam slide, it's really trying to get at the complexity of that issue. Next slide, Heather. What is collective impact really is not about collaboration as usual or a single sector approach. It's really on focusing on longer term solutions and longer term impacts. Next slide. For those of you that have heard this before, we know that there are 3 important preconditions for collective impact. These include influential champions. They also include adequate resources and urgency around the issue. And the 3 preconditions, we think at Tamarack that these are really essential to effective collective impact approaches, to pay attention to these preconditions as you start to move your collective impact effort forward. And it's actually linked into the conversation that we're going to have today about communities, because influential champions and adequate resources are elements of some of the 7 habits. And I think, Jay, as we get into your part of the presentation, that you're also going to tackle this issue of urgency of the issue. So there's real alignment between your thinking, Jay, and the preconditions of collective impact. Equally, there are the 5 core conditions of collective impact, and the conditions are a common agenda. So how do we build together this shared vision for change? How are we going to know that we're making progress? And that's the whole idea of shared measurement. Mutually reinforcing activities is really the notion of leveraging what already exists in our communities and actually aligning them in a way that will drive change forward. Continuous communications is critical in collective impact, particularly when you bring diverse players together. And then finally, you know, investing in a backbone infrastructure or a backbone support. And so, you know, we wanted to, in the first set of slides, really set the context for the conversation, because the things that we understand in terms of community readiness is not only understanding that community issues are complex and the experiences of individuals within communities are complex, but there are frameworks like collective impact that allow us to kind of tackle some of this complexity. So can we go to the next slide, Heather? So now we want to spend the bulk of the presentation really talking about this notion of, you know, with community at the center, how do we build our community change muscle? How do we get our communities ready for, you know, tackling complex issues and using a framework like collective impact or any kind of community change framework that you have engaged in, whether it's collaboration or network building. So what are the elements that we have to focus on from a community change perspective that really help us build that kind of community change muscle? So I'm going to turn it over to you now, Jay, as Heather turns over to the next slide, to really tell us about your thinking about these 7 habits of highly effective communities. I know you've written a lot about them. So maybe we can spend a few minutes going through each of the habits. You can go through each of the habits and tell us a little bit about your thinking behind them.
Well, great, Liz, and it's such a joy to be able to join the group today. I have such high regard for work of Tamarack, and as Liz and I were talking before the seminar started, is Tamarack and I have known each other for probably now more than 10 years, and so some of the context in which I'm going to be talking about the 7 habits really precede and in many ways kind of built into the collective impact movement. So in many ways, when I was thinking about the 7 habits, it was really from the basis of not what you need to be ready for collective impact, but it really is, what was it about those communities that were achieving very transformative change within their community, and what did it look like in those communities? And so it's slightly different vantage point, but I think that helps bring context to the point about readiness for collective impact. And the first observation, the first thing that we saw in these highly effective communities, and we visited over to 75 communities as we were doing this work, is we saw those communities that were truly achieving change were those communities that actually reached for it, that actually set out a target that was over and above what they were doing right now, or over and above how do we do our work more efficiently. And I think Liz pointed out in kind of that historical focus about activities or fragments that we've seen within communities, we tend to get so focused on the things that we do. We found in those highly effective communities that focusing on that overarching goal, focusing on that aspiration, became a key point towards motivating and engaging folks. It actually became a very key point in terms of creating that sense of urgency that Liz talked about as being ready, gets them better able to do the kind of work that they have to do in the classroom. Well, why is that important? Well, to be able to be successful in that work gets them to be able to have developed successful skills like third grade reading, which leads to high school graduation, which leads to other great outcomes both educationally and in the community. So having the community beginning to push and continue to push and reach for itself, we found is a very strong indicator of moving in collective impact. The next step, which I think is also important, is you really have to go with who you got. So often we try to say, well, we've got to have X, Y, and Z at this table to move forward. Well, what you're basically doing in that context then is giving X, Y, or Z the veto on whether this moves forward. And sometimes X, Y, or Z represents the historical, here's how we've always done it. So you've got to say to the people that are at that table, how do we create this movement so it will galvanize and create energy for other people to join us? Because in many ways, what we're trying to do is create that center that Liz was talking about. The community is center. We're trying to create, through that high aspiration, that sense of going with who you got around that table. It's kind of like the core of a planet, a clear, strong sense of purpose that creates a gravitational pull that will bring people, effort, and resources and commitments to the process. So by having clarity about that aspiration, by going with the people that are energized by that, you're actually going to bring more people to that table as opposed to waiting for the right people to be there. In many ways, the right people will come as you begin moving forward. Action is captivating in and of itself. And that relates to that next point in terms of keeping the circle open, is that so many times there's this sense of, well, I was at the table at the beginning and therefore I have some sort of right of legitimacy. And the whole part of community engagement, collective impact, is how do we continue to bring more and more people into the discussion. So we have to keep that circle open. We have to engage people to join us to say, well, if you weren't there from day one, by all means join us on day 20 or join us on day 350, because that's the momentum that we're trying to create. To be able to do that, we need really three things in place. We need to have effective communication. What is that aspiration? What is that goal that we're reaching for? How are we doing that? We have to have an invitation. People have to feel that sense that they could join at any moment. We also always have to have that empty chair, if you will. And we can't do what historically we've done in a number of nonprofits. It's say, well, come to our board meetings for about 2 or 3 years, and you'll get an understanding of what we're doing, and then you'll be able to contribute. We need to have people have this sense of how do they contribute from day one, but we also need to be able to give them a sense of how to contribute without having everybody to go back to step one. And so there needs to be this sense of clarity of orientation. How do we bring people on board to how we work? What is our jargon? What is our or lack of jargon, I should say? What is our way of moving forward that engages folks? And in many ways, this relates directly to the next point, and that is we really have to avoid the blame game. I can't tell you how many sessions, whether it was homelessness or whether it was education or whether it's poverty, is almost the first meetings were a process of blaming the status quo, blaming the folks that weren't doing it before. And our experience has been in these now well over 100 communities is I have yet to find somebody maliciously behind the scenes that's trying to make sure that our families don't succeed or trying to make sure that children don't read at grade level. Is that we've been basically trapped by those systems and those approaches that we had before, that as we're trying to think about how best do we respond in that suboptimal system, we're doing things that in light of working differently, in light of working in collective impact, do seem suboptimal. But that's not something to be blamed. That's something to be encouraged and brought along to how do we work differently. And that, I think, moves us into the sixth habit. And this to me is the centerpiece, and it's certainly one of the key cornerstones of collective impact, and that is choose measurable outcomes. I had a quote from somebody in a session in Indiana, Illinois, and she pretty much said it very succinctly, is that if you're looking for success in real estate, the one guideline is location, location, location. For community solutions, for collective impact, that one guideline should be outcome, outcome, outcome. There should be real clarity about what is it that we're trying to achieve, how do we know that we're making progress, how do the various individual contributors across multiple organizations, across multiple groups, understand that their work is moving us towards this outcome. And I'm going to kind of give a counter example of a disappointing meeting that I was at earlier this week. Is we had in the U.S. a national, very large, influential foundation that was making its midpoint report on the progress that it had made in terms of its very significant effort. And I'm not going to go and detail the specific effort because that might give the foundation away. But they started at a very sense of clarity about what it was that they were going to try to achieve. But over those 5 years, they lost sight of what those specific measurable outcomes were, and they reported back in terms of that they can demonstrate good progress, that they can demonstrate strong effort. So 5 years in, they're now talking about progress and effort without clarity about what it was that those measurable outcomes were. And so setting those measurable outcomes at the beginning of the process and then making sure that you're faithful and maintaining the focus on those measurable outcomes is a key to developing this momentum that we talked about, developing the expectation that we can actually reach for the high expectations. Measurable outcomes are the main tool to be able to take the yet to be convinced, the people that aren't sure that this process will work, and bring them on board. And an example that I've always used in zeroing in on education is that the main driver for children's success, and in this context, say third grade reading, is not children's skill levels. We have not seen a problem of being able to support and change and develop those skills. It really has been in terms of adult expectations. And those are adults within the classroom, within the education system, and within the community. Oh, those kids can never be able to succeed. And by having clear, measurable outcomes that we're able to demonstrate, well, yes, they can. All of those children can actually be on third grade reading and actually have an average of fifth grade reading results, high poverty, high English as a second language kind of demographics. But the only way we were able to change those adult expectations to line up with what children could actually achieve were those measurable outcomes. And I'm now going to just leave it at that last point that Liz was talking about in terms of that sense of urgency. If we're talking about how to break up that cycle of intergenerational poverty and using education to do that, or supporting families in terms of livable incomes and affordable wages, it has to have that profound sense of urgency, that this is too important to have business as usual. And if we're run into a roadblock in one way, how do we reorganize? How do we pivot to be able to get this process and this momentum going? By having that very clear aspiration at the beginning, that reaching for it gives you that sense to continue to build this sense of urgency that this is too important not to be able to continue to work and to continue to expand who joins us at the center. Liz?
Yeah, Jay, before we go on from this slide, I just want to build on a couple of points that you made, because I do think it is really important. And, you know, the first point is, you were writing about this stuff before collective impact. So you were observing communities before collective impact came along, which I think is interesting because there's lots of parallels between, you know, what you've identified in the 7 habits and also the 3 preconditions and the 5 conditions of collective impact. But I think you go a little bit deeper as well, at least in my opinion. And you know, when I think about collective impact, I think about the collective, right? And how do we understand the collective? And for me, the collective is the community. And it's not, you know, a small subset of group of individuals, you know, thinking, oh, we're going to move the needle on poverty, because it won't happen. It's really saying, how can we get our community to both understand the urgency of this issue, understand the context of this issue, build an aspiration, and then really embrace it, right? And really embrace the change that's going to happen. And I think that, you know, that's a kind of an add-on to this notion of collective impact is, how do we put the city at the center of our collective impact work? And I wonder if you have a couple of comments about that.
I think you're absolutely right, Liz, is that when I worry about collective impact in some communities, I worry about it that it isn't the full community, that in many cases it might be work among subject matter experts. Even though they've engaged more institutions that have been around the table before, it really doesn't involve the people that are living the experience, the people in the community that actually have to change their behaviors to be able to get to these outcomes. No matter how large the session, even if it's a full stadium wide in a community, you are not going to change these outcomes by that group. It has to be, how do we transmit and connect with that larger community that are actually changing their behaviors and their expectations. So I've used a measure, Liz, in so many of our communities where if you're talking about that table, the action team tables, if you will, is I want to have at least 50% of people at those tables that don't have, quote, skin in the game, that aren't part of the system, that aren't part of the process, but are actually people that can move and motivate and change the clarity about what it is that we're trying to accomplish. And so, yes, you need to have your subject matter experts, but you also have to have those people that this community is what they're passionate about. And collective impact then becomes a means to achieve that and not an end in itself.
Well, that's a really good point, that collective impact is a means to achieve the common agenda, not an end in and of itself. The other point that I want you to maybe riff on for a couple of more minutes is this idea of an aspiration, which I know in collective impact language is framed as a common agenda. But can you talk about the notion, which I think you add value to, around an aspirational common agenda?
Yeah, in many ways, and again, it goes back to this work of looking at successful communities prior to the frame of collective impact, prior to that wonderful kind of clarity that John Cania and his team brought to what some of this work is involved. And what I saw in community after community is that there was real clarity about what it was that we are trying to achieve. I give an example in some very, very tough neighborhoods on the north side of Minneapolis, some of the 9 highest poverty communities there in the state of Minnesota. And I could walk into Lucille's Kitchen, which was a great barbecue place there on Broadway in Plymouth in North Minneapolis, And just in the time that it took me to get from the door to put in my order, I could get a sense just in that community that there was a discussion of what it was that they were working on, what it was that they believed in. And so that's when you're transforming a sense of we've got to work these tactics or we've got to work these activities to a sense of the community saying we're going to have a different community because they were very clear about what that goal is. That is, all of these communities that are working together to achieve this particular aspiration. And I haven't had any community that has picked the same aspiration as a prior community because that really is situational specific. And so we've had some communities that have really talked about how do we make this community the place where people want to live, work, and thrive. In other communities, we have things that are perhaps even more specific in terms of, you know, eliminating homelessness or eradicating poverty. But I think, Liz, one of your old stomping grounds in Hamilton, Ontario, probably captured it best, where this was work about poverty reduction. And as you remember, Liz, when I started working with Hamilton, I was bringing this perspective of aspiration. And as we got the people that are doing the heavy lifting at the round table and other people in the community at these conversations and kept reaching out, the community as a whole told us, yes, poverty is really, addressing poverty is really important, getting more kids educated, but what that means to us as a community is we want to make Hamilton the best place to raise a child. And what that did, that sent goosebumps and frissions throughout that community that I think affected how the newspaper looked at this effort, how everybody looked at it, this effort. It wasn't kind of same old, same old. This was a challenge, and that everybody could understand what it was that they had to do uniquely in their own way, whether it was as a parent around the dining room table or whether it was the head of the United Way or the Y, what it was that they had to do to contribute to Hamilton being the best place to raise a child. It's that kind of aspiration that I think aligns and engages and really calls out to that full community. Underneath that, the roundtable then had strategies and actions and measurable outcomes in terms of what are we going to do that's going to get us to that point. But having the community own getting the best place to raise a child also gave the community a sense of, well, what do I have to do?
Yeah, I think you're right about that. It's really interesting. I think these habits are really important considerations to think about. How do you, if you're moving forward a collective impact initiative, how do you engage with these habits in a way that really helps transform your community? So thanks, Jay, for sharing these habits with us. I read them a number of years ago, but I think they continue to resonate with me, and I think they're important to consider. Heather, maybe we can go on to the next slide, which is really to talk about some other research, and I know, Jay, you're familiar with this research as well, around where communities are at. And I think it's what I take away from this research by the Harwood Institute is that communities, not every community is in the same place, right? And not every community is maybe ready to take on a full-on collective impact initiative. And so Harwood says, and their research says that, there are some communities that are simply waiting, or they're in a waiting place, that they have a sense that, there might be something, but there's not actually the leadership in place, or there's nothing really critical there, or there isn't the collective sense that there's something critical there to create that kind of pivot point. The next type of community that he talks about is this community that is at an impasse, right, where there is, people recognize that there are problems and issues in that community, but they always consider it to be somebody else's problem, right? That, oh, they'll take care of it over there, or it's the healthcare sector's problem, or it's the education's, grade. You talked a lot about grade 3 reading scores. Well, that's considered to be the education system's problem as opposed to our problem. And so those communities, when you're trying to move collective impact forward, are a little bit more challenging because there's the blame game is happening there, right? The next three types of communities, I think, are ones where collective impact is maybe a little bit best suited. And so Rich Harwood talks about this idea of a catalytic community where, you know, you have the right mix of people that understand that there is a problem, people that are willing to do a little bit of investment in understanding a little bit more about the urgency of the issue, and that you are able to get some of those kind of leaders around the table. Maybe not all of them, but you at least have strategies for having enough leaders around the table that can get you, you know, access to some of the resources that you need. There are also, they would say, growth communities, where the focus of those communities is really about engaging citizens in community change efforts, and then finally renewal and sustaining communities. I would say, and Jay, I'll turn it over to you for a second, but I would say catalytic and growth are two community types that's where collective impact probably can be seeded quite quickly and move forward quite quickly. What's your take on this?
Oh, I agree, Liz, but to me, where I have the most kind of fun is at that impasse level, because in many ways it's just how do you change your point of view? How do you change how you're looking at a problem that can create energy and motivation? So if you'd say where do I kind of have the most fun in terms of beginning to engage a community, and I've had communities invite me in all the way from the Chamber of Commerce to the Community Foundation to the United Way to school systems or whatever. And oftentimes I see that impasse point as really just on the precipice of moving to catalyst.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of where I see that. I don't think that there has to be this sit back and wait and hope some sort of external environment would take place. I'm a very strong proponent of people picking up and getting to action. And so I think the impasse gives a lot of opportunity. I wouldn't wait to look around to say, do we see signs of people gearing up for change? Because I think impasse oftentimes can get us to that, well, how do we gear up?
Yeah, I think you're right about that. And so that's a really great question. So let's go to the next slide, Heather, which is how we gear up. So Harwood, in his research, went one step forward and said, you know, these are conditions to create an enabling community environment, right? And so these are things, and I think that these, you know, align nicely with your kind of 7 habits, and maybe build a little bit more on them. But he would suggest that, you know, you need multiple layers of leadership in a community, right? So you need to be able to identify, you know, who are those players, and who are the leaders, you know, whether they're leaders at the neighborhood level, whether they're the leaders very much in the issue orientation, you know, the leaders with the lived experience, right through to kind of the traditional leaders that we identify in communities, business leaders and the elected officials. So do we have those multiple layers of leadership in our communities, and do we have access to them? The other thing that Harwood would talk about is this notion of boundary-spanning organizations. And those are often, you mentioned United Ways and YMCAs, community foundations. There might be think tank kind of organizations, volunteer centers in communities. Do we have organizations that kind of span across a couple of boundaries and have connections into, you know, the for-profit sector, the not-for-profit sector, and the public sector, and even the neighborhood or community sector, and can we bring them to the table? Is there a sense of purpose, which aligns really nicely with, you know, the common agenda, but also the aspiration? I think the next point is really important, this shared community story, and I know that you told the Hamilton story about making Hamilton the best place to raise a child, but I think it's important to kind of understand in communities, what is our meta community story, right? What is the story we tell ourselves about the city of Hamilton, for example? And for those of you that know anything about Hamilton, you know, it's a manufacturing town with steel industry. You know, we're a little gritty, we have a little bit of dirt under our fingernails, but that's a positive story because that means we have a just do it kind of attitude, right? So what is your community story, and how will that story influence your collective impact approach? Is there, or can you build community ownership around the issue? So if you have those multiple layers of leadership, can you get those leaders to own the solution? And I think that that's critical. What are the specific strategies that best fit your community? I was just in Evansville, Indiana, and we were talking about engaging the community in a healthy eating, active living, collective impact initiative. And I said, oh, okay, so we have till the end of June to have our community engagement session because everybody goes for vacation after, the end of June. And they said, well, actually in Evansville, people are on vacation already because the schools end at the end of May. So I didn't know that, right? So my strategy was, okay, based in the Canadian context, we have till the end of June. They said, no, we have to actually have our session in August because that's when people start gearing up for the fall again. So it's interesting to think about, the nuances of each community and how we have to figure out strategies that actually fit those particular nuances. The focus on impact, I think you talk about it as outcomes, and I think it's, again, a critical one. And then this enabling environment that Harwood has framed, but I think is actually, you called it, Jay, in some of your writing, a community support organization, and in the collective impact context, it's called the backbone infrastructure. So it's these things that really create this enabling environment to really help communities get ready to tackle these bigger, complex issues. Any comments you want to make about some of the Harwood work?
Yeah, to me, the whole concept of community ownership is really multi-layered, as is the leadership. I agree with, how Harwood is looking at community ownership in terms of, does the leadership own, getting to the solution? But the other thing is we have to be very careful that, and I had this more of a problem earlier on than really exists now, but that institutions tended to brand this work as theirs. This is the United Way effort, or this is X, Y, or Z effort. And what happens when you do that, even though they own it, they're a community leader that owns that, what they do is that they actually put distance to the rest of the community in terms of, you as the community, you can kind of fold your arms and watch, and we'll get this fixed. And I think we've seen education do that. I think we've seen the healthcare structure. When I talk about community ownership, and when I've seen community ownership, is when it really is transmitted to the community as a whole, and that those members of the community own the fact that they have to do work. They have to change. It's not going to be things that are going to be done for them. So that then puts the institutions, the organizations, the historic activities and program responses as tools to achieve something, again, not as ends in of themselves.
I think you're absolutely right about that. And I think, there can be a fairly simple strategy that you have in collective impact where once you've determined kind of your strategies, then you invite the community to say, what are we doing already that's helping to advance these strategies, right? That's that whole idea of mutually reinforcing activities. And really thinking about, okay, so how do we build from the base that we already have, right? How do we allow that ownership to drive forward the change that we envision together? So really great point. Let's move to the next slide, Heather. So where to from here? I think one of the things I saw in the audience questions that someone asked if we will be sending the slides around. We actually will be as part of the post email that we send out about this presentation, but we'd also invite your feedback because Jay and I have been thinking about this for a while now in terms of community readiness and have been thinking about, who's out there writing about community readiness, but we'd love to hear your questions. So Heather, I want to turn it over to you and see if we got any questions during the presentation from our audience.
Yes, thanks Jay and Liz for this awesome presentation. So the floor is open to everyone, all the attendees. Put your questions into the question box, and I will read them out. And while you're doing that, I just want to make a comment that in previous work that I've done in the community, Liz and Jay, we've always waited for the stars to line up before we moved forward. And Jay, you said something that kind of resonated with me, in that start from where you are. So I just want to know if you wanted to comment on that.
Yeah, I think, Heather, that's a really important observation, is that in my experience, and then in terms of looking at communities that have been making progress, is there wasn't a thunderclap. There wasn't a aha moment, this gets us all in the right place. There really was, and I think the pieces that Liz talked about, Harwood, and looking at that, are all instructive. But to a certain extent, it really has to be, we've got to pick up and act. And collective impact gives us some great kind of guidelines and rules in terms of how do we kind of organize that action, if you will. But fundamentally, it is about how do we as a community act to be able to achieve that aspiration. So I'm much more convinced that getting started will create the momentum, as opposed to waiting for the momentum so that you can jump on.
Yeah, I agree, and I think that there are times where even in our very gut, we kind of know that something isn't right? And so we might be going to endless meetings and being a little bit dissatisfied with the outcome. So I think you're right, Jay. I think there is that kind of doing that little bit of a gut check and saying, okay, so here's an idea I have. Let me start talking to some people about this idea and see if I can get some momentum going, right? And so to see if you can get to that, with whether it's impasse, which I take your point around, sometimes impasse is fun to work with, because even though people think it's somebody else's problem, at least they're identifying a problem, right? Or if it's catalytic, or those other zones of community, that you still have that opportunity to say, okay, so I think this is a problem. How many other people in the community think this is a problem? And then how do we, or opportunity sometimes, because collective impact isn't always about problems. It can also be about opportunities. So then how do we build enough vigor around that opportunity?
Exactly.
Any other questions?
Yeah, we have another question. So collective impact is about complex issues. There's a question here about how do you know that your issue is complex, or is it because they were talking about they're trying to get working with farmers and healthy foods and farming, and is that a broad topic, or is that a complex issue?
Let me just jump in first. I guess the framing, I would say collective impact is a mechanism about how to achieve a different state, a more important outcome or a more important aspiration. And then as you start looking at that, you begin possibly in some context to be confronted with the complexity, all of the moving parts. But I wouldn't look at collective impact as only on the shelf, if you will, for complex issues, or is our issue complex enough? I think we really look at what is it that we're trying to achieve, and are there people from different places, different sectors that have stake, either in terms of response or being reacted upon, or action and moving upon something to be able to change the result, to change the outcome. In that context, it's very much driven by where do we want to go, what is our aspiration, and then how do we best use collective impact to do that. I think complexity, as Liz was talking about, is something that certainly we're seeing in the vast majority of how do we roll up our sleeves to do something. But I would look at collective impact as fundamentally a mechanism to get to a change state.
Yeah, and we talk about it from the lens of really trying to change policy systems and environments, right? And I think that once you start to think about that change state, you know, what are the policies that need to be shifted? What are the systems that need to be shifted? What are some of those environmental contexts that need to be shifted? That actually does kind of take you from programmatic solutions to kind of this higher order of solutions where there are other people involved, right, and other kind of systems involved. So it takes you to that systems thinking area.
Mm-hmm. We have another question. It's around the shared measurement piece. And so they're asking, you know, bringing research in will help to move a community forward. So I think they're kind of wondering, how would you use the research to move a community forward on an issue?
Again, first of all, I think research is very important, but I really think we need to start, in all of our communities, I really talk about what are the historic kind of measurements that we've used. And I've looked at measurements, and I think this comes from, I'm drawing a blank on it, but some really good work that has led before in terms of results-based work. And yeah, there you go. I'm sorry. And what they talk about is a matrix in terms of that we can have measures that are, you know, high quality, high impact, or measures that are low quality, low impact. And so what you're trying to do is make sure as you start thinking about measures that you're really thinking about those measures that are, you know, of a high quality kind of action and result, or action, and then that gets that kind of result. And so I think that matrix is an important way to think of it, and to put it in context is 90% of the measures that we use right now are measures about activities and not measures about results. And so I think we have to, if we use research, we have to use it in such a way that we're looking at making sure that we're measuring that change state and not just the fragments that were the kind of historical impediment that Liz talked about at the very beginning. So understanding outcomes and then applying research in that way. But right now, very small percentage of the measures that we're using in most of our communities are at that real high-end result and outcome level.
And we're going to, as part of this series, we will spend one of the webinars diving a little bit deeper into shared measurements. So, you know, if that's a topic that you're interested in, it's a little bit further down in the series, but we're going to go through each of the conditions of collective impact and spend an hour just diving into that condition and really trying to get an understanding. But I agree with you, Jay. I think that, you know, for collective impact, we have to, you know, we do have to have some sense of what is the problem, right? And so that is some of that existing data, you know, who's impacted by this problem, and kind of what are their circumstances, and then really get to that kind of impact. You know, exactly. What's the change state that we want to see, as you say so effectively?
Right. And I think that the distinction is almost like we've got to make sure that we're moving from, and I'll go back to reading in terms of how many books are we being able to make available for kids, which is a counting kind of thing, to how many children are reading at grade level.
Yes, exactly. Heather, any other questions?
You know what? We have a lot of questions. I don't think we're going to get through them all, but I will commit to tallying all the questions, and maybe in a post email we might be able to address a few more. But I have one here I think we should address before we go, and it's talking about leadership. And you both mentioned about getting, you know, diverse voices at the table, and so the question is, how do you work with multiple voices, multiple opinions, and be able to move forward?
I have found that clarity of that aspiration has actually, and I've had report back from, you know, community after community, that people that, you know, were intransient before, that were very difficult to move, are not creating that same kind of problem or kind of dysfunction. And so I think in many ways that how you go about thinking about the solution, where you're trying to go, allows you to move above that kind of historical strategy activity level, because that's where people are defensive on. Wait a second, you know, our entire agency is based on providing meals, and we're worried that you're going to be attacking, you know, the providing of meals and that. Whereas if you're talking at a different aspirational level, the question then becomes, how does that providing of meals really lock into and assure us that we're getting to that aspiration level? So a lot of times, by moving the conversation away from the strategy or the activity, you know, the ideological, this is what we really believe, to what is it that we're trying to accomplish, we've seen creates less of that disruption and allows people, some people, as I said at the very beginning, you know, go with who you got. Some people aren't comfortable at that stage. But as you create momentum and as you create measurable outcomes, they'll come back.
So Heather, I think we should go to the next slide really quickly, because it is a little bit of a next step for moving to action. So do you want to talk a little bit about these workshops?
Yeah, so Tamarack has several opportunities that you can, you know, dive deeper into collective impact and learn about community engagement. So the slide that you see here is our one-day workshops, and they're all within Ontario. So we have one in Toronto on June 14th, and Aurelia on June 20th, and in London on June 23rd. So if you just go to the Tamarack .ca, you'll be able to see all of our events and register there. We also have a 5-day event on Community Change Institute, where one of the streams within this event is all around collective impact, and another stream is community engagement and innovation. So this 5-day event, September 26th to 30th in Toronto. We have some amazing speakers, and this is a great opportunity to learn a lot more about working with your community. You will leave there with your brain hurting because there's so much out there, and you will learn so much. And then we have some upcoming webinars that are happening with our other communities in Tamarack. And of course, we have our next webinar for the Collective Impact series, Preconditions of Collective Impact. And all of these can be found on the Tamarack community webpage. And I also want to address the Ontario Trillium Foundation's new granting stream. They have a collective impact granting stream, which is new, and you can find more information by going to their webpage. You can call their support center or talk to the local program manager. And if you don't know your local program manager, if you go to the OTF webpage, there is a list of program managers and the regions that they cover. I want to take this opportunity to again thank Jay and Liz and you for attending the webinar. I will be sending the presentation and any resources and some answers to these amazing questions that came in next week. And that is all we have. Thanks, Liz.
Great,
Jay.
thank you.
Thanks, everybody, for joining us as well. And thank you, Jay, for taking time out of your busy day before your long Memorial Day weekend in the United States for coming on the call. And really, really appreciate your sharing your wisdom, Jay.
You're welcome, Liz. It was a pleasure, and it's so good to talk to my friends in Canada.
Thanks so much. And hopefully everybody will join us for the next webinar in this series. Goodbye, everybody.